Can we do this later? Our guest is waiting. We'll get to Dorothee Klaus, who is the director in Lebanon for UNRWA, and she's going to speak to you about the situation in the Ein El-Hilweh camp. Ms. Klaus, welcome. Thanks for joining our briefing.
Thank you so much, and hello to everybody. So we've seen armed hostilities in the Ein El-Hilweh camp that lasted between the 30th of July and the 3rd of August. The days of hostilities have left several hundreds of families displaced, some of which have returned meanwhile. We've had destruction of habitat. Between 200 and 400 houses are expected to have been demolished within the camp and in the vicinities. And we've had an UNRWA school complex for over 3,000 children violated, and additional installations, including other schools and a health center, possibly also damaged. We are still not able to access all of the camp. We have reopened services that were closed during the hostilities in about 50% of the camp, which means one health center. We've been collecting garbage, disinfecting, and started removing rubble there. I have been in the camp on Monday to meet with some of the refugees there in our health center, and the image was that of distress, talks about children having been traumatized, women's hair having been turned white during the hostilities. I think this also needs to be understood in the context of multiple displacement that Palestine refugees have experienced over the past 75 years in Lebanon. Many of the camps have been destroyed not only once, but several times. And Ein El-Hilweh in particular, which is home to over 50,000 Palestine refugees, is undergoing these bouts of violence and clashes and destructions of their habitat on a regular basis. The last time was during March. We're seeing the impact of these traumatizations, re-traumatizations in the Palestine refugee community in Lebanon, with very high rates of non-communicable diseases, which we attribute to very high levels of stress. Very concerning also has been to us the interrelations between the Ein El-Hilweh camp Palestine refugees in Saida and Saida city that was shut down for over 5 days during a time of heightened summer tourism, which means that an already economically depressed situation became further depressed. Palestine refugees currently in Lebanon experience about 80% poverty, which is alleviated by UNRWA's cash assistance, and poverty and unemployment in the Ein El-Hilweh camp are very high. The camp remains unstable at this point in time, but we do hope to be able to return soon also to those areas that are currently closed, to start with the removal of unexploded ordnances and remnants of war. I'll stop here. Thank you.
First question goes to Edith Lederer.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you again for doing this update. The situation sounds quite dire, and as you just said, it keeps repeating the last time in March. What could or should be done to keep this from happening again in another few months?
Well, we hope that the concerned parties see this also as an opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity to thresh out a roadmap for preventing this from happening. We're counting on a high-level meeting between various Palestinian parties and the Lebanese next week, which we will also participate in, looking at some of the mechanisms for the rehabilitation and reconstruction process. And some of these questions will certainly be asked. What can all parties do to prevent this from happening again?
All right. Ibtisam?
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim, Al-Arabi Al-Jadid newspaper. I have first two follow-ups. You said that you are not able to access part of the camp. If you could clarify why. And then also, you talked about the trauma and the mental health needs. To which extent you are able to provide such help for the communities. And if you could give us, you touched a little bit upon it, but if you could give us a broader picture about the situation of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And the last thing, what about aid and money to fix these houses? Thank you. Sorry, too many questions.
Okay, let me respond to you. Why we're not being able to access. Half of the camp is still considered a hot area. There are no hostilities ongoing, but armed fighters are still dispositioned. And it is not safe for any UN personnel to access these areas currently. We're also not having clearance from the Lebanese military to go inside those areas, the Lebanese military being in control of access to the Ein El-Hilweh camp. In terms of trauma and re-traumatization, it's something we're trying to better understand, also the interrelations with the very high rates of non-communicable diseases, because we do see an association there. We have built up a force of social workers that has been professionally trained on providing psychosocial support. We're currently building up a professional cadre of school counselors to work with our 40,000 children. We do have psychologists and psychiatrists also in our health centers. So it is an area which we believe needs to be expanded. It is a population that is very depressed, and that comes from a sense of being very helpless, and that helplessness often translates into either levels of aggression, which are also directed against UNRWA at times, and we do understand and absorb, or infliction of self-destructive behaviors such as substance, drug abuse, and violence within the families. So it is indeed a very desperate picture for a community that has very little future outlook that is positive. After 75 years, they're still prevented from working in the regular middle-class professions, doctors, lawyers, engineers, prevented. All those that have studied in that direction are desperate or have already migrated, leaving very vulnerable populations behind. Palestine refugees are also not permitted to own immovable property, which means they cannot accumulate wealth, and they can also not inherit to their children. So that's a bit on the general picture of Palestine refugees in Lebanon. We're talking about 200 to 250,000 persons. We have 12 refugee camps. About 50% of the population lives inside the camp, and the others often live in the vicinity. In terms of aid, you're for sure familiar with the chronic financial shortfall of UNRWA as an agency. For Lebanon in particular, we're seeking on a priority basis still $12 million for cash assistance for about 65% of the population. Again, I mentioned 80% in poverty without cash assistance. It would be over 90%. We see this as a major stabilizing factor at a time when, and I'm sure you're following this, the country is in an extremely fragile moment here. We also, and let's not forget about that, have Nahr al-Bared camp that was completely destroyed in 2007, where we still have an outstanding bill of 37 million to construct the remaining shelters of persons that have remained displaced to date.
Okay, Ephraim?
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Ephraim Kosaifi, Arab News Daily. This is, of course, happening within the larger context of a severe economic crisis in Lebanon. How would you say, in general, have the events since 2019 until today affected the camps and the residents of the camps, especially Ein El-Hilweh?
Well, when we're talking about poverty, poverty has already been over twice the level of what it used to be in the Lebanese population prior to the economic crisis. So that means the resilience levels in the Palestinian population in Lebanon have been even less to then wither the impact of the crisis. Employment is relegated to sectors which do not offer fixed employment. So Palestinians in Lebanon hardly ever have a regular contract, leave alone any form of social security. So that means that around 50% of the men above the age of 16 are currently unemployed, and the remainder have sporadic employment, and all of that, of course, reflects in the income and their ability to sustain themselves. A hospitalization nearly turns out into a crisis for every family, as UNRWA is only able to cover a certain proportion in the expenditures. So the very fragile environment further leaves Palestinians in a host country where they've had a very complicated relationship with their environment, and the Lebanese now suffering too doesn't make the relation much easier between the two communities.
Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, I'd like once again to thank our guest, Dorothee Klaus. Thanks very much for joining our briefing, and good luck to you in your work ahead. Thanks. Have